Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, Holocaust survivors, veterans of the Second World War and your families, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to welcome you to the annual Holocaust Memorial Ceremony at the United Nations, organized in observance of the International Day of Commemoration in Memory of the Victims of the Holocaust. I would ask everyone to please use your earpiece because you will have better sound if you do so. My name is Melissa Fleming, and I'm the UN's Undersecretary General for Global Communications. It is my privilege to be able to be part of this ceremony, which is being held this year under the theme 75 Years After Auschwitz, Holocaust Education and Remembrance for Global Justice. At this time, I would like to ask the Holocaust survivors and Second World War veterans with us today to kindly stand or raise your hand so we can recognize and honor each and every one of you. We are honored by your presence, and we thank you and also your families and your friends who've accompanied you here for supporting you and for being with us today. I would now like to invite Mr. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Tijani Muhammad Bande, President of the UN General Assembly, Judge Theodore Meron, keynote speaker and former president of the UN International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals, Mr. Dan Pavel Dolki, chief contact point for Roma and Sinti issues, senior advisor on Roma and Sinti issues, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as well as Holocaust survivors, Mr. Shangra Milstein and Miss Irene Shashar, to light a candle, each in honor and in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. May I request all who can to rise to do so for the reciting by Rabbi Schneier, who is Ambassador to the UN Alliance of Civilizations and also former U.S. alternative representative to the United Nations. I'm sure all of you know him. He is going to be reciting the Kaddish, the traditional mourner's prayer.
"75 years ago, in January 18, I was liberated by the Red Army in Budapest, Hungary. Most of the Hungarian Jews, 425,000, including my grandparents, shipped to Auschwitz, the graveyard, exterminated in the crematory of Auschwitz. So when we gather today, on the first day of the month of Shvat, which ushers in the new year of the Tree of Life, we want to pay tribute, above all, also not only remembering our deceased 6 million men, women, and children of the Jewish people, but also the liberators who removed the tyranny, the Nazi tyranny, from Europe. So when we recite the prayer, and the Tree of Life New Year is observed a week from today, Tu B'Shvat, Let us plant seeds for peace and harmony. But as we recite the Kaddish in memory, may we make a pledge. We stand united against hate. We stand united against antisemitism. We stand united against xenophobia and racism and any form of bigotry. And now I'd like you to join me in the recital of the prayer. And that's our pledge to those who lost their lives during that terrible calamity that faced Europe. Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabah v'yalmad yvrach Yerusei v'yamlich b'chusei v'chai echon v'yom echon v'chai d'chol beis Yisrael v'agolav v'izman kariv v'imru amen Yehei shmei rabah mevrach le'olam al-memayo Yisparach v'yishtabach v'yisvar v'yisumam v'yisnasei v'yisadar v'yisaleh v'yisalol shemei d'kedusha b'richu le'lam min kol b'chasa v'shirasa v'shbechasa v'nechem asa v'amiram v'yalma v'imru amen Yehei Shlomo Rabba min Shemaya, v'chaim leinu v'kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom v'imromav, hu yaseh shalom b'aleinu, v'kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Schneier. Could I ask everyone to be seated, please, and to welcome to the podium the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres.
Dear Holocaust survivors, dear veterans of the Second World War, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. We meet in the General Assembly of the United Nations today to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, to remember the 6 million Jews and many others who were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators during the Holocaust, and to recommit to preventing any repetition of those crimes. I extend a special welcome to the survivors here with us today. We are all deeply grateful to them and to all Holocaust survivors who inspire us with their strength and their example. Our solidarity in the face of hatred is needed today more than ever, as we see a deeply worrying resurgence in anti-Semitic attacks around the world and, almost unbelievable, also around us, here in New York. Just 30 miles from here, less than a month ago, a knife attack on a Hanukkah party left 5 people injured at the rabbi's house in the small community of Monsey. That came just a few weeks after the killing of 4 people at the kosher supermarket in New Jersey. New York saw a 21% rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes in 2019, part of a trend in cities across the United States. But the situation for Jews in Europe is, if anything, worse. France saw a 74% increase in anti-Semitic attacks in 2018. In the United Kingdom, they rose by 16% to a record high. An attack on a synagogue in the German town of Halle during Yom Kippur last October left 2 people dead. And in Italy, an 89-year-old Holocaust survivor was provided with an armed escort after she suffered a torrent of anti-Semitic abuse. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we need to name this phenomenon for what it is. There is a global crisis of anti-Semitic hatred, a constant stream of attacks targeting Jews, their institutions, and property. Almost every day brings new reports of hate crimes. Many of the perpetrators are inspired by previous attacks, glorifying the assailants and creating a self-reinforcing vortex of violence. Neo-Nazis and white supremacists are resurgent, organizing themselves and spreading their poisonous ideology and iconography online. The internet, from social media to online gaming platforms and the dark web, is their playground and their recruiting office. They manipulate video content and poison young minds. This upsurge of anti-Semitism cannot be seen in isolation from an extremely troubling increase in xenophobia, homophobia, discrimination and hatred in many parts of the world, targeting people on the basis of their identity, including race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and immigration status. Attacks against religious minorities are a particular concern. Around the world, we have seen Jews murdered in synagogues, their gravestones defaced with swastikas, Christians killed at prayer, their churches torched, and Muslims gunned down in mosques, their religious sites vandalized. As the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Jonathan Sacks, has said, the hate that begins with Jews never ends there. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, 75 years ago today, when the soldiers of the Soviet army entered Auschwitz, they were stunned into silence by what they saw. The Nazis' efforts to hide their crimes were undermined by the clear evidence of millions of pieces of clothing and tons of hair. To quote Primo Levi, the liberators felt, and I quote, guilt that such a crime should exist, end of quote. Like the soldiers, we are revolted by the horrific details of Auschwitz. But it is our duty to look and to continue looking, to learn and to relearn the lessons of the Holocaust so that it is never repeated. And the most important lesson is that the Holocaust was not an aberration committed at a particular moment in history by a few unspeakably sick people. It was the culmination of millennia of hatred, from the Roman Empire to the pogroms of the Middle Ages. My own country, Portugal, committed an act of utterly cruelty and stupidity by expelling its Jewish population in the end of the 15th century. European Jews were excluded from almost all areas of economic activity, scapegoated if they succeeded, and defined as inferior. One scheme put forward decades before Hitler's rise to power involved shipping all Eastern Europe's Jews to the African island of Madagascar. When I visited Yad Vashem 2 years ago, I was appalled once again by the ability of anti-Semitism to reinvent itself and re-emerge over millennia. It takes new forms. It may be spread by new techniques, but it is the same old hatred, and we can never lower our guards. And far from being the project of a few insane individuals, the Nazi attempt to exterminate Jews and other vulnerable people involved architects, scientists, doctors, lawyers, engineers, drivers, bureaucrats, soldiers. Millions of ordinary people were desensitized to crimes against humanity taking place around them, often described by euphemisms like special measures. As the great writer Hannah Arendt said, most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. The Holocaust was a complex operation arising from long-held prejudices and required the corruption of society from top to bottom, the corruption of language, of education, and political discourse. As we work to live up to the promise of never again, we need to examine our own prejudices, guard against the misuse of our own technology, and be alert to any signs that hatred is being normalized. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, prejudice and hatred thrive on insecurity, frustrated expectations, ignorance, and resentment. Populist leaders exploit these feelings to whip up fear in pursuit of power. When any group of people is defined as a problem, it becomes easier to commit human rights abuses and to normalize discrimination against them. Combating prejudices requires leadership at all levels that fosters social cohesion and addresses the root causes of hatred. It requires investment in all parts of society that all can contribute in a spirit of mutual respect. Promoting social cohesion and human rights and addressing discrimination and hatred are among the overriding aims of the United Nations through our efforts to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The decade of action I launched last week is aimed at stepping up support for countries around the world to build inclusive, diverse, respectful societies that provide lives of dignity and opportunity for all. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, l'éducation est un élément essentiel de la solution. L'ignorance est le terreau du mensonge et du révisionnisme. Plus jamais ça, cela veut dire enseigner l'histoire encore et encore. Les rescapés de l'Holocauste avancent en âge et c'est à nous qu'il revient de transmettre leur témoignage aux nouvelles générations. Nous devons également chérir celles et ceux dont la vie même est un camouflet envers les forces de la haine et du mal. De nombreux rescapés vivent dans des conditions difficiles. Il nous incombe de leur offrir dignité et sécurité au crépuscule de leur existence. Les musées ont un rôle important à jouer et j'ai été impressionné par la créativité avec laquelle les technologies interactives sont utilisées pour préserver le témoignage des survivants. L'exposition qui se tient actuellement dans l'entrée des visiteurs, intitulée « Certains étaient nos voisins », montre comment la collaboration et la complicité se sont propagées dans la société allemande et les pays sous occupation nazie. L'UNESCO et le programme de communication sur l'Holocauste et les Nations Unies offrent des documents écrits et vidéos qui permettent d'informer, de sensibiliser et d'inciter à agir contre la haine et la discrimination partout dans le monde. Nous nous employons à promouvoir une utilisation responsable des technologies qui accélèrent la diffusion des discours de haine et des fausses informations, notamment sur les médias sociaux. Les efforts déployés jusqu'à présent se sont avérés insuffisants, mais certaines initiatives récentes sont encourageantes. La stratégie et le plan d'action des Nations Unies contre les discours de haine que j'ai lancé l'année dernière concrétise notre engagement à agir tous ensemble contre ce fléau. Et j'ai l'intention de faire avancer les travaux en organisant cette année une conférence interministérielle. On a également lancé le plan d'action des Nations Unies pour la sauvegarde des sites religieux qui contient des recommandations concrètes pour aider les États à faire en sorte que leurs citoyens puissent pratiquer leur culte en paix. En outre, les nouvelles technologies de surveillance peuvent également être détournées par les États et les entreprises pour discriminer certaines personnes ou les priver de leurs droits. Le groupe de haut niveau sur la coopération numérique a recommandé des mesures pour protéger les droits humains à l'ère du numérique, mesures que nous entendons mettre en œuvre en coopération avec tous les acteurs. Il s'agira notamment de travailler avec nos partenaires pour définir des normes qui favorisent une utilisation juste, responsable et transparente de l'intelligence artificielle et du cyberespace. Nous devons unir nos efforts pour protéger les personnes dans cet environnement non réglementé. Et nous devons aussi nous efforcer d'empêcher la corruption de la langue. Nous ne pouvons permettre que des euphémismes et des expressions codées soient utilisés pour occulter des idées sectaires ou des crimes. Les mots peuvent tuer. L'Holocauste a commencé par des mots. Nous devons être vigilants face aux mots et aux expressions inspirées d'idées nazies comme le sang et le sol, qui font leur retour dans certains pays aussi invraisemblables que cela puisse paraître. Nous ne pouvons accepter qu'une rhétorique empoisonnée et délétère devienne la norme. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, nous commémorons cette année le 75e anniversaire de la libération d'Auschwitz-Birkenau par l'Armée rouge, ainsi que la création de l'ONU. De l'horreur indescriptible des camps de la mort est né un monde nouveau, fondé sur le respect mutuel et le sentiment de notre humanité commune. Aujourd'hui, alors que nos valeurs sont attaquées de toutes parts, nous réaffirmons nos principes avec plus de conviction que jamais. Nous n'oublierons jamais. Nous nous élèverons chaque jour et partout contre l'antisémitisme, l'intolérance et toute forme de haine. Nous resterons unis pour défendre les droits humains et la dignité de tous. Et je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your remarks. It is now my honor to introduce Mr. Tijani Mohammed Bande, President of the United Nations General Assembly. Your Excellency.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Under Secretary General for Global Communications, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Holocaust remains the most horrific genocide in human history. Today, we are privileged to listen to Ms. Irene Shasa and Mr. Sharga Milstein, two Holocaust survivors who overcame the severest form of persecution. Their reminiscences energize our collective consciousness for a more inclusive, peaceful, and harmonious global community that encourages unity in diversity. The chilling account of their experiences should serve as a reminder to all of us that we need to do more for humanity to ensure that we continue to promote respect for individual human beings and multilateralism as potent instruments for resolving conflicts and avoiding acts of contrivances that could lead to dehumanizing others, leading to heinous crimes such as the Holocaust. More importantly, they should remind us of the constant need to be vigilant by collectively promoting efforts that discourage hate, slogans, and speeches, including other intolerable biases that fuel discrimination, xenophobia, and other prejudices. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted on 10 December 1948, emerged from the ashes of the Second World War. With the creation of the United Nations, the international community vowed never again to allow the atrocities like those that could create conflicts of the kind that we are witnessing also today. Many systematic acts of violence today remind us of the consequences of the international community's inability to act, or even slowness in acting. 75 years after the Holocaust, it is difficult to grasp the level of hatred that killed 6 million Jews. At least 1.1 million Muslim Jews lost their lives in Auschwitz. The Holocaust was a crime against humanity, and the darkness of Auschwitz seems inconceivable. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, recent polls have shown that the understanding of the Holocaust is fading with each generation. At the same time, we experience a wave of antisemitism plaguing countries around the world. Young people today are bound to be leaders of tomorrow. We need to ensure that these atrocities of the Holocaust are not repeated. The responsibility for educating the young about this and all heinous crimes is ours. We have an obligation to educate young people about what happens when human dignity is in jeopardy. It's important to present this history to young people in a way that they can understand the lessons learned and develop a moral compass that makes central the virtues of tolerance, acceptance, and solidarity. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, let me state that as members of the peace-loving global community, we have always to remember the victims of Holocaust and ensure that their experiences serve as a constant reminder of the need to promote peace, harmony, tolerance, cooperation, and inclusion in our collective aspirations for a more peaceful and prosperous world. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is now my pleasure to introduce His Excellency, Mr. Danny Danon, Permanent Representative of Israel to the United Nations.
President of the General Assembly, Mohammed Bande, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, thank you for your important words and for your moral clarity in the fight against anti-Semitism. Her Excellency, Ambassador Norman Chalet, Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States, His Excellency, Ambassador Nabinezia, Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation, it was an honor last week to co-sponsor with you the opening of the exhibition on the liberation of Auschwitz here at the UN. His Excellency, Ambassador Heusgen, Permanent Representative of Germany, Thank you for your strong commitment to the remembrance of the Holocaust. Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, veterans, distinguished survivors. On this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, we are honored to have Shraga Milstein and Irene Shashar, who came from Israel, to share their testimonies with us. Thank you for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, as the decades go by, it becomes harder for us to remember the atrocities that took place and what the victims had to endure. We are the last generation to have the privilege of learning about the Holocaust from those who had endured its atrocities. And when memory starts to fade, so does the ability to believe that an event like the Holocaust really occurred. It becomes harder to believe that being a Jew under the Nazi regime was enough of a reason to rip infants from their mothers' arms, to force communities into ghettos, starve them, murder them in the most cruel ways, and then burn their bodies in an attempt to destroy the evidence and erase them from memory. It becomes harder to believe that people stood by as their Jewish neighbors were stripped of their rights and dignity. It becomes harder to believe that governments watched the Nazis legislate away Jewish rights, and the reaction was to ban Jewish refugees from reaching their shores. It is hard to believe that human race is capable of such evil. Because it is hard to believe, this day of the International Holocaust Remembrance must truly be that, international. It cannot be an Israeli Day of Remembrance, or even a Jewish Day of Remembrance. It must be a day in which the entire world remembers what can happen when anti-Semitism festers. A day in which the entire world remembers that words are not enough. When the Nazi regime came into power in 1993 with anti-Semitic platform, no one spoke up. When the Nuremberg laws came into effect in 1935, yes, they were condemned by some, but no real action was taken. Finally, in 1938, the international community convened the Evian Conference, in which the outcome was more hollow words. The leaders of the world may have opposed anti-Semitism. They may have even denounced it, but that is all they did. And as we know, that wasn't enough. Last week, Israel hosted the World Holocaust Forum, where the leaders of the world vowed never again. It was an inspiring event, and we truly thank the leaders for their strong words against anti-Semitism. But now is the time not just for words. Now is the time to act against anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a deadly disease that must be eradicated. It is a disease that feeds off hate, ignorance, and intolerance. It manifests itself in different ways, such as xenophobia and racism. Like with any disease, the international community must work together to eradicate anti-Semitism. It is not enough to say that we want to eradicate it. We must find a cure for those affected by it today, and we must vaccinate our populations so that no one will have to suffer its fatal consequences in the future. In order to cure those affected today, each state must fight anti-Semitism in its society by punishing those who spread it. Talking is not enough. Zero-tolerance policies must be implemented through 3 steps. First, legislation. New laws against hate crimes and incitement must be passed. Second, enforcement. It is not enough to have laws banning hate crimes. They must be enforced. and finally, awareness. Leaders must learn about the Holocaust to understand what anti-Semitism can lead to. We are taking important steps here at the UN. I have led close to 100 ambassadors on missions to Poland and Israel to learn about the Holocaust and become witnesses. In April, we will go together to Auschwitz to march in the March of the Living. Additionally, Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion, Ahmad Shahid's report on anti-Semitism, which was presented in this room to the General Assembly a few months ago, makes important recommendations in this regard. I urge all countries to embrace the report's recommendations and implement them, including adapting a definition of anti-Semitism that defines denying the right of the Jewish people to a state in Israel as anti-Semitic. In order to rid the world of the disease, we must also vaccinate our societies. The only vaccine against anti-Semitism is education. Education to ideas such as compassion, understanding, and tolerance. We must educate that other does not mean inferior. We must educate that to generalize is dangerous. We must educate that disagreements are never an excuse for violence. We must educate that regardless of a person's religion, ethnicity, or skin color, he or she are still worthy of human dignity. Ladies and gentlemen, we will have the honor of hearing from brave survivors today. Their testimony makes it clear that words are not enough. When strong action isn't taken against anti-Semitism, the disease can take the lives of millions of innocent people. Today, I say to the survivors and to the whole world, despite the rising voices of anti-Semitism, today the reality is different. Today we have the state of Israel. Today we have the Israeli Defense Forces who keep us safe. Today we are able to protect ourselves. The days of the Jewish people being defenseless are over. On this important day, we thank you for condemning anti-Semitism, but we also say it is not enough. It is time to join us in taking action. We must never forget what happened, and we must ensure that it never happens again. Am Israel Chai.
Thank you, Ambassador Dannen. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, His Excellency Mr. Christoph Heusgen, who is the permanent representative of Germany to the United Nations.
Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to first greet all the Holocaust survivors here in the room, and in particular Ms. Shashar and Mr. Milstein. We are humbled and honored to have you here. Your strength inspires us. Excellencies, President of the General Assembly, Secretary General, distinguished guests, when the German Chancellor Angela Merkel visited Auschwitz-Birkenau in December, she voiced her shame for the unspeakable crimes committed in this German Nazi concentration camp, whose 75th year of liberation we mark today. I too am ashamed standing in front of you today, knowing that it was Germans, my countrymen and countrywomen, who were responsible for the complete breakdown of civilization and the barbaric descent into systematic murder preceded by incomprehensible cruelty. It is therefore not evident that I, the German permanent representative to the United Nations, should be given the opportunity to speak here today. And yet at the same time, I feel deeply thankful to be able to do so. On the one hand, it is testament to the reconciliation and trust building that has allowed Germany to once again become part of the international community. On the other hand, and more importantly, today's commemoration allows Germany to join you in remembering the millions of victims of the Nazi regime. And we do remember the 6 million Jews, the Sinti and Roma, the disabled persons, LGBTI persons, the forced laborers, and all others who were stripped of their dignity and made to suffer under the German Nazi regime all across Europe. We also remember the relatives who lived on after the Holocaust with the agonizing scars inflicted by hate, and also pay tribute to their strength. When Germany takes the chair of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance this year, we hope to play our part in keeping the millions of memories alive for generations to come and to learn from history. I also invite you to join us tomorrow in opening an exhibition downstairs in this building about the first generation of Holocaust researchers who were instrumental in recording the atrocities and shining a light on the German perpetrators. Yet we understand, as our Federal President Frank Steinmeier said last week at Yad Vashem, that there is a real danger that we Germans understand our history better than we do our present. And indeed, we cannot deny that anti-Semitism is on the rise again. Just last year, on Yom Kippur, a man attacked a synagogue in the German town of Halle. Thankfully, the door of the synagogue held. Sadly, however, the perpetrator went on to murder 2 others. And this is just one example from my country. Let me quote the Holocaust survivor Rabbi Schneier, whose Sabbath service I had the honor to attend on Saturday morning. I quote, "Anti-Semitism is a cancer that was in remission and now has metastasized." Excellencies, distinguished guests, please accept that we will do all in our power to counter a renewed rise of anti-Semitism in Germany and in the world. We will protect Jewish life and we will stand by Israel. This is our highest duty and part of our national identity and is part of our commitment to democracy and human rights. Sadly, as we know, such values are under attack from all sides. Bigotry and hatred abound both online and offline. Leaders and political systems guarantee their political survival by trampling on human dignity. This is unacceptable. There is a danger of never again becoming a hollow phrase, and Germany works tirelessly to prevent it from becoming one. We do this in Germany with youth education, for example, through an initiative called Youth Remembers. And I agree with the Israeli ambassador who just highlighted the need for education. And I support all the proposals made that all children, all school children in Germany should visit Auschwitz concentration camp. But we also do it at the international level through our membership in the Security Council and our support for global justice by way of the International Criminal Court. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today, 75 years later, the Auschwitz Memorial and Museum makes the crimes visible to us by displaying the murdered children's shoes, the gas chambers, the train carriages meant for livestock but used for humans, and the photos and names of the victims. By looking at them, we can remember the Holocaust. But these things also make us understand that we will never find words adequate enough to describe the Shoah, not even for the briefest of moments. I pay deepest respect to the victims. I pay my deepest respect to the survivors and the families. And thank you again for allowing me to be here today to remember with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Heusgen, and it is now my honor to introduce His Excellency Vasily Nebenzia, the permanent representative of Russia to the United Nations.
Dear Holocaust survivors, dear veterans, President of the General Assembly, Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, it is a great honor for me to address you today when the world marks the 75th anniversary of the liberation by the Red Army of Auschwitz-Birkenau, one of the most terrible Nazi death camps. That name and place has become a nominous symbol of one of the worst tragedies in human history, the Holocaust. Before the liberation, almost no reliable information about Nazi concentration camps was available either in the USSR or in the West. What liberators found defied any description. Reminiscences and memoirs of the Soviet soldiers of the First Ukrainian Front of the Red Army, who opened the gates of this Nazi death factory, convey shock, pain, resentment, and compassion. In that hell where people from various countries were sent for torture, monstrous experiments, and mass extermination, many and many hundreds of thousands, millions of people of various nationalities were sadistically and methodically murdered. More than half of them were Jews. 6 million Jews were tortured to death in ghettos and concentration camps, were grisly killed during punitive operations. 40% of them were citizens of the Soviet Union. Holocaust has been and will be a wound, a tragedy that we will always remember. At the same time, we cannot forget that while deliberately exterminating Jews, Nazis were preparing the same fate to befall on many other nationalities: Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, and many others. Inhumane ideology of racial superiority envisaged that they would either be exterminated or become slaves. Back then, in 1945, nations of the world united to build an anti-Hitler coalition to stop those barbarous plans. The Soviet Union paid in that war an ultimate price of 27 million lives. USSR took upon itself the main blow of Hitler Germany, withstood it, and brought to the world liberation from Nazism. The gates of Auschwitz would not have opened in 1945 had it not been for the heroic defense of Brest, Minsk, Kiev, Odessa, Sebastopol, had it not been for the Red Army that stopped Hitler troops at the gates of Moscow and destroyed them at Stalingrad, defeated Nazi hordes at Kursk, had it not been for our American and British allies who were pushing forward from the West, draining power and resources of Wehrmacht, and thus bringing the world closer to the date of great victory. Today, we mourn the victims of Nazism. Today, we honor those who survived its terrors. Today, we pay tribute to those who sacrificed their lives in fighting this absolute evil. Today, we pay respect to the heroic veterans of World War II. And we pray that such thing never, ever happens again. To ensure this, we must not forget who committed this evil, who masterminded and performed Holocaust, who started the war and brought grief to dozens of millions. We also must not forget those collaborators who were helping them, no matter what their motives might have been. It is important to learn history lessons right in order to prevent such catastrophes as the Holocaust and World War II. That is why we are uncompromising with attempts to rewrite history, equate the victims and aggressors. For the sake of peace and justice, and for the sake of future generations, we must not turn the blind eye to manifestations of aggressive nationalism, xenophobia, antisemitism, racism. We all are responsible for keeping the memory of that war, of the victims of Nazism and crimes of their accomplices, of the horrors of Holocaust, of death camps, of besieged heroic Leningrad, of Babi Yar, of the village of Khatyn burned to the ground, of the dead and living heroes. That is why every year General Assembly, at the initiative of the Russian Federation, adopts a resolution on combating glorification of Nazism. This year, the world celebrates the 75th anniversary of the Great Victory and of the creation of the United Nations. Therefore, the words that resounded in the Soviet Union, "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten," are as relevant as ever before, as well as never again. The victims of the Holocaust are not forgotten. Those who died fighting against Nazism are not forgotten. The verdicts of the Nuremberg Tribunal are not forgotten. It is our sacred duty to keep this memory and to be worthy of the heroism and sacrifice of those who paid with their lives for our lives and for our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Her Excellency Ms. Sherith Norman Shallot, Acting Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations.
Mr. Secretary General, President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to be here with you today as we offer our reflections and prayers, honoring the victims of the Holocaust and observing that 75 years have now passed since the horrors of Auschwitz. We especially welcome the Holocaust survivors here today. On a day like today, a day that rightly calls for education and remembrance of what the Jewish people suffered during the Second World War, we are reminded that the phrase "never again" has not ceased to carry urgent meaning. For while we remember the liberation of Nazi Germany's deadliest extermination camp, we must also acknowledge that in too many places since, too many groups of people have suffered from targeted violence and oppression and still suffer from them today. In the blur of activities that consume the time of the United Nations and the work of individual governments, we rarely stop to reflect on what "never again" demands from us, but it is essential that we do so. Of course, "never again" demands that we take seriously our responsibility to remember and tell the story of the Holocaust, how it is that human beings could countenance such shocking inhumanity, the peoples whose lives were destroyed or unalterably changed as a result, and why we cannot allow anyone to distort or deny the truth of what occurred. In saying "never again," we affirm our commitment to preserving the historical record and to honoring the victims of the Holocaust. What it also means is that we must be vigilant in combating the alarming rise in antisemitism that we see around the world, and that we must be persistent and intentional about informing younger generations of what came before. This task is especially urgent as young people today are increasingly unaware of what the Holocaust was and the anti-Semitism in which it was rooted. As we know, the Nazi regime did not limit its campaign of terror to Jewish men, women, and children. The disabled and infirm, Slavs, Roma, and other ethnic and minority groups were subjected to similar fates. And in truth, when we look around the world, we have since seen many groups of vulnerable people suffer unthinkable violence and oppression, from the victims of Stalin, Pol Pot, and Mao, to the genocide against the Tutsis and the ethnic cleansing of the Bosnian Muslims. Even today, we see minority groups singled out by their governments for human rights abuses. To combat these abuses, whether they emerge from anti-Semitism or some other disease of the human heart, collective remembrance and collective action are required. If we fail to remember the depravities of Auschwitz, of Dachau, and of Buchenwald, if we do not teach our children about the world's inaction as a trickle of violence became a flood, if we cease to identify the ways in which the poison of anti-Semitism and dehumanization of the other continues to harm members of the human family, then we will forget what must be done to fight for those who are marginalized in the world today. For our part, the United States is resolute in its commitment to speak out against anti-Semitism, fight for the dignity of all people, and work alongside the nations of the world so that never again is not merely a call to action, but the outcome of our decision to act on behalf of the weak and the vulnerable. May we never forget the victims of the Holocaust and all other victims of Nazi persecution, whom we honor and remember today. And may their memories ever be a blessing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we are all extremely honored to welcome now Itzhak Perlman, the great violinist. Itzhak Perlman, please come to the stage and honor us with your performance. Mr. Perlman, for your moving rendition. Music often expresses more than words can ever hope to capture, and it is understood intuitively, regardless of the language we speak. Music is a language of humanity that we all share. The victims of the Holocaust included those labeled by the Nazis with derogatory terms like Zigeuner or gypsies, men, women, and children from the Roma and Sinti communities considered by the Nazis as racially impure. The Nazis committed to destroying the Roma communities. I would now like to invite Mr. Dan Pavel Dogi, Chief Contact Point for Roma and Sinti Issues from the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights for the Office for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He will share some remarks with us.
Respected organizers of this important remembrance ceremony, Secretary General Guterres, esteemed survivors of the Holocaust, honorable speakers and audience. The Jewish people were targeted for extermination by the Nazi regime, its allies and collaborators, based on racist and supremacy ideologies. They suffered the highest toll of loss of human lives in the Holocaust. Besides them, on the same racist grounds, the Roma people were also targeted for extermination. The Nazis' violent solution has brought these two populations very close to their full extinction, with 6 million people Jews and 500,000 Roma and Sinti being killed. Other groups have been also persecuted and killed, such as people with disabilities, political opponents, some religious minorities, prisoners of war, and sexual minorities. Realizing that their quest for world supremacy is coming to an end, the Nazis went to great lengths to hide their heinous crimes and avoid being made accountable for what has been recognized to be one of the darkest and largest-scale atrocities in the history of humankind, the Holocaust. For decades after the Second World War, the Roma Holocaust was not acknowledged by states as being an integral part of the Holocaust and was similarly ignored by historians and scholars who turn a blind eye to the fact that the Roma people were, as the Jewish people, targeted for extermination based on racial grounds. The forgotten Holocaust of the Roma has inflicted a deep trauma among the Roma and Sinti survivors, precluding them from opening up and sharing their suffering within their families and with the society. As late as in the 80s, some survivors have dared to speak up about their horrific experience under the Nazi. One of the bravest survivors and human rights activists, Mr. Romani Rose, has led decades' worth of efforts paving the way for the recognition of the Roma genocide. More recently, groups of Roma activists and intellectuals have advocated until the European Parliament has recognized the 2nd of August as being the European Roma Holocaust Memorial Day. I mention here the important roles of Ms. Soraya Post, a former MEP, the Tendipe Roma Youth Network, and DIC and Abister Initiative. 2nd of August 1944 is the day when the Nazis have liquidated the remaining close to 3,000 Roma men, women and children of the Zigeuner Lager, the gypsy camp of the Auschwitz-Birkenau. Formally, the Roma Holocaust is still not being recognized. It is time now, 75 years since the ending of the Second World War, that justice for Roma is done without further delay, and that the very definition of the Holocaust is corrected to properly acknowledge the Roma and their suffering during the Second World War as being an integral part of the Holocaust. We witness nowadays how racist ideologies rooted in the same flawed and dangerous belief that some human beings are superior to others manifest unabatedly in our society. Racism has permeated the highest political and government levels, unfolding in an unchecked manner in what is proven to have become a climate of acceptance and impunity. Antisemitism, anti-Roma rhetoric, and hate-motivated crimes and incidents against these people make the headlines every day and risk becoming an unacceptable normality. This must end. Today, as we commemorate worldwide the victims of the Holocaust, I humbly urge all states, politicians, and international organizations to upscale their efforts and ensure that this essential history lesson is fully learned, so that the terrible suffering inflicted by the Nazi racist ideology upon the humankind will never repeat. I emphasize the essential duty and responsibility of the governments and politicians to firmly condemn all forms of racism and nationalist extremism and to fight prejudice and discrimination. We must never forget the Holocaust. We must preserve and respect the memory of its victims. We must educate the younger generations about the Holocaust and about the danger that the racist ideology is posing to our society. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Dogi. The Nazis and their accomplices murdered over 1.5 million children, a staggering number. But there were some who survived. They survived because they were hidden. Such a child was Irena Shachar. Ms. Shachar was barely 2 years old when her mother smuggled herself and her little daughter out of the Warsaw Ghetto. Her father had been murdered there. Through hiding and luck, the two of them survived the Holocaust. We are so privileged to have Ms. Shachar with us today, and it is my honor to welcome her to share with us her experiences.
Ladies and gentlemen, I stand here today in front of you to tell you Hitler did not win. I was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1937. My name when I was born was Ruth Lewkowicz Kirschenberg. We had a comfortable home and I felt safe and secure. One of my fondest memories were days when I refused to eat, only opening my mouth to squeal with delight when my beloved grandmother would open her colorful umbrella and I would intake the food. In retrospect, I would have been much more willing to eat had I known what was coming. By the time I was 2 years old, I would be starving in the Warsaw Ghetto. The year was 1939. The seeds of genocide had been planted, and the poison of Nazism invaded Poland. We were forcibly moved into the ghetto. Survival was the only thing that mattered. But some part of me hoped and believed that it was all temporary. It was a fluke, that it was all a big mistake, and we would go back to our rightful homes and continue our lives. Of course, that was not the case. The move to the ghetto was only the beginning of our suffering. One afternoon, when my mother and I were out searching for food on the streets, we heard blood-curdling screams over the usual clamor of the ghetto. Mother yanked my little arm and took off in the direction of our cramped living quarters that we knew then as our home. She dashed up the stairway, pushing through the crowd, with me, a toddler, clinging to her arm. Once we reached the landing, the crowd was even thicker. Our door, the door of our apartment, was open. Lying in the kitchen was my father. I could see his clothes, his ratty dress shirt, trousers, and schleikes, his suspenders. He was limp. He was bleeding from a gash on the side of the throat. My mother threw herself on top of him. She let out a wail that could be heard on the other side of the planet. Her iron grip on my arm was unceasing. I was trapped, listening to her cries and feeling her racking sobs against my tiny body. As we stayed in that huddle, my left elbow had nowhere else to sit except in a pool of my father's blood. The abysmal conditions of the ghetto had already ruined my pretty dress, but now it was soaked through and through with the harsh red liquid seeping from my father's fatal wound. We lay there for what felt like an eternity until someone pulled me off. My parents pulled me away from my parents and took me out of the room. I was relieved. I was relieved to be away from the scene, but that was the last time I ever saw my father. We were now on our own. Our survival became even more desperate. I felt a change in my mother's mood and in her mannerisms, but I couldn't pinpoint a reason for this change. One day, during our hunt for scraps of food, our pace was even more brisk than usual. My mother was weighed down by a large bag, and I had my precious doll, my Lalechka, who was not typically a companion for those expeditions for sustenance. Suddenly, I was tossed down a sewer. I waited in fear for Mother to join me, and as I waited, my eyes adjusted to the darkness of the grimy, pestilent tunnel. Where are we now? What is this? All I could see and all I could feel was the stream of water rushing past me. It was wet, it was dirty, it was awful. The relentless stream of water kept splashing in my face. My mother pushed me to move through the foul gutter. It was soggy. There was a tremendous stench. We were crossing the sewer for the whole ghetto area. All these years later, I can still smell the stench of that seemingly endless passage. Rats skittered past me all over. My only companion among those vermin was my beloved doll, my Lalechka. As I crawled along, holding her, she became soaked through with the foul water and scent. She was my stunning little doll, and even she was not safe of this hell on earth. As quickly and as forcefully as it had begun, the pushing from behind suddenly stopped. My mother threw me above ground and clambered up after me. To this day, I still wonder how she knew how far we had to crawl in order to emerge outside of the ghetto walls. How did she calculate the distance? How were we able to climb into the sewer and emerge undetected? For the remainder of the war, I was a hidden child. My mother would say to me, "If you don't cry and you're a good girl, this will soon be over and we'll go out to play." It all lasted an eternity. My mother died in 1948, leaving me as an orphan in the care of her beloved niece's family in Peru, who gave me a new life and new beginning. I was victorious over Hitler, thanks to my mother's overwhelming sacrifice, a priceless, selfless act of courage. I was blessed with the chance to survive and to thrive in adulthood, thanks to her. I was blessed with the opportunity to have children and grandchildren because I saw my family tree. Hitler did not win. I did the very thing he tried so hard to prevent. Allow me for a bit to share with you the branches of my family tree. My son, David, lives in Israel, works as a doctor. His wife, Rotem, is an intensive care nurse, and they brought me three grandchildren. Nevo, 8, is a very gifted child, of course, my grandson. Omer, 6, is a blue-eyed dancer and painter. Doron, 3, is a sweet doll with blonde hair and blue eyes. My daughter, Ilana, is a social worker in the Shoham municipality. She's married to Asaf, a lawyer. And they gave me four grandchildren. Yarden, 16, was my first grandchild. His birth marked my victory over Hitler. Thank you. It provided me with an reinvigorated purpose I could never have imagined. Yarden is active in sports, scouts, and he's an excellent student. Of course, my grandson. Yahel, 12, and looks like I did at her age. Shira, 9, is a talented skater, and Ivry, 7, is lovable and curious. He enjoys sports and, of course, the internet. I moved to Modi'in, Israel, last year to bear and to be near them and to delight in their growth and success. This is a tribute to my mother, as is my whole life, along with the lives of my children and my grandchildren. I need your voice, the voice of the United Nations, the United Nations that arose out of the ashes of World War II. I need your voice because without it, silence is indifference. Throughout the course of my life, I realized that it is not only my responsibility, but it is my obligation. An obligation to the 1.5 million children who were not as fortunate as myself to remind humanity that good can indeed triumph over evil. Diversity is legitimate. Not all people need to be the same or even alike, nor do they need to have the same beliefs. But everyone needs to have tolerance for the beliefs of others, and minority views need to be protected. I have emerged from the Shoah with hope and courage, and with a dream to the world. Please don't let my dream turn into a nightmare. Don't let my mother's triumph go for naught. Life is a gift, not to be taken for granted. Hitler did not win. Don't let Hitler ever, ever win. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Shashar, for your incredibly moving personal story. I think no one in this room will ever forget your story and never forget your powerful messages. Thank you very much. We have another Holocaust survivor to give his testimony today, Mr. Shagra Milstein. Mr. Milstein was born in Poland. He was 6 years old when Germany invaded his homeland. Unlike millions of other Jewish children, women, and men, Mr. Milstein survived the Holocaust, but his own parents did not. In 1948, the orphaned teenager moved to Israel, where he has lived ever since. He has held numerous leadership positions, including the chair of the Masua Institute for Holocaust Studies. Mr. Milstein currently serves as chair of the board of the Organization of Bergen-Belsen Survivors in Israel. Mr. Milstein, it is an honor to have you with us here today, and including your 3 children and your 9 grandchildren who are with us.
Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, the President of the General Assembly, fellow survivors, Your Excellencies, honorable delegates, and distinguished guests. As mentioned, on September 1st, 1939, I was 6 years old, eager to begin school in the first grade. But on that very day, the German army crossed the Polish border and World War II began. I never entered the first grade. I never was able to learn at any school until 6 years later, when I was 12 years old. I was born in 1933 in Piotrków in central Poland into a Jewish middle-class family. My father, Hillel, was a businessman. My mother, Rebecca, a housewife, and I still recall her playing the piano that stood in our living room. My brother Mordechai, who was 3 years younger than I. The Nazis set up the first ghetto on Polish soil in my town in October 8, 1939. An area of houses was fenced off, including ours. The ghetto housed 22,000 people in an area that was home for about 6,000 before the war. I was confined to my room and strictly warned not to leave it without an adult. This is my earliest memory of the Holocaust. The switch from free and comfortable life to being closed off in a room at the age of 6 with constant fear what the next hour will bring. Life in the ghetto was bearable mainly because of the love and protection of our parents, who tried to prevent me from seeing blood or dead bodies in the streets, which were common sight. At the end of the day, we were so sorry. In 4 days, beginning October 14th, we were assembled in a big open square and had to walk 4 in a row past a ranking SS officer who stood on a lorry. As he neared him, he was marking with his finger. Right, left. At the end of the day, there were 2 groups. One was told to walk under guard to the railway station, and the second to return to our homes. This is my first memory of the infamous selections conducted by the Nazis. I still don't understand why and how, but mother, father, brother, and me were not separated, ordered to return home. Other members of my family, aunts, uncles, cousins, were not so lucky. the population of the ghetto was reduced to 3,000 people, and I learned after the war that all others were taken by cattle train to Treblinka. From 1942 through October 43, 870,000 Jews were murdered there. The Nazis did not only murder Jews, but also tried to destroy Jewish culture and rob our private and public property, the struggle for which still continues today. The people that remained in the ghetto were sent to 2 nearby labor camps. We found ourselves at the Bugay wood factory. At the age of 11, I worked 8 to 10 hours a day as an apprentice to a woodcutter. In May 44, we were shipped in a cattle wagon to Germany, my father, brother, and myself to Buchenwald, and mother to Ravensbrück. When we parted at the train station was the last time I saw her. A few days after our arrival in Buchenwald, my father came home to our barrack in the evening with a stern look in his face. He took my brother and myself aside and said, "We have to part and we will not see each other again. Take care of your brother, remember your names, and the fact that you have family in Palestine." He gave us a hug and we went to sleep. I later learned that the next day he was killed at the age of 43. All my efforts during the years to find out what happened and how he knew his fate were in vain. A few weeks later, I was transferred with a group of friends my age to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. In Bergen-Belsen, there were no executions, but people died there from severe hunger, cold, and ailments. From 1943 till liberation, about 140,000 people were imprisoned in Bergen-Belsen, and over 50,000 of them, men, women, and children, died at the camp after prolonged suffering. To those who deny the Holocaust and want to rewrite history, let me quote Brigadier General H.L. Glenn Hughes, Chief Medical Officer of the 2nd British Division, who arrived on site with the advancing British forces. The British soldiers did not believe their eyes. They were shocked and perplexed by what looked at the sight of hell. Piles of corpses were scattered everywhere. One such heap in the women's camp was very high and about 80 yards long. The sight, with all its horror, was mild compared to what we found inside the barracks. Living people were lying next to dead corpses. There was no hygiene, no water. The walking skeletons could not get up to take the little food we provided them. End of quote. On April 15th, my world changed from complete neglect and apathy to human compassion and a true effort to help the scared, hungry, and the sick. Within days, we were taken by the British military commanders from the squalor of the concentration camp to a proper housing and a clean bed in a nearby Wehrmacht military facility. The Bergen-Belsen camp was burned, and on it are today mass graves and the memorial site, museum and seminar center managed by the Lower Saxony Memorials Foundation. Keeping the memory of the atrocities alive and presenting visitors a world of human understanding, tolerance, freedom, and democracy based on equality of every human being. I was reunited with my brother and left in June 1945 to Sweden for convalescence as guest of the Swedish Red Cross and the Swedish government. I'm grateful to the British forces for freeing us in Bergen-Belsen and to the Swedish government for bringing us back to life. I reached Israel weeks before its declaration of independence in 1948 and lived there ever since. Married, raised a family of 3 sons and 9 grandchildren, all of whom are present with us today. As you may recall, I mentioned how I last saw my father. So when my second son was born on December 15th, 1958, we named him Hillel, after my late father. 11 years later, my brother's daughter was born also on December 15th, and she was named Hilela. A few years ago, I was invited to Buchenwald and learned from their archives that my father was shot on December 15th, 1944. The same date that his grandson and granddaughter were born. Makes you think. Let me conclude by saying that the Holocaust is not only a historical event without proportions, but also a guide to personal choices in present-day life. Those of us who survived this atrocity and people of goodwill across the world firmly believe that it's our duty to condemn and prevent any intolerance against people based on ethnic origin or religion. Thank you for allowing me to share my story with you today, and may we never forget the lesson of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Milstein, for sharing your incredibly moving testimony with us, and especially for traveling so far to be with us on this auspicious day. Your firsthand account and that of Mrs. Shashar reminds us of the urgent need to continue combating anti-Semitism and injustice, and what more powerful way to do that than to hear the firsthand accounts of those who've gone through it. We are so grateful to have you both with us today. I have now the honor to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Judge Theodore Meron. Mr. Meron's career encapsulates a life lived defending justice globally. Judge Meron served as judge of the appeals chambers of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He served 4 terms as president of the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and in 2011, Judge Meron was elected judge of the Mechanism for International Criminal Tribunals and served 3 terms as president. Since May 2019, Judge Meron has been an honorary visiting fellow at Trinity College, Oxford. Judge Meron has received numerous honors. In 2019, he was awarded Honorary Champion of the Most Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George. Judge Meron, I welcome you to the podium.
Mr. Secretary General, Under Secretary Fleming, the President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, distinguished guests. I am honored to have been invited to deliver this keynote on this 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army and the annual day of commemoration in the memory of the victims of the Holocaust, which resulted in the murder of 1/3 of the Jewish people and countless Roma and other undesirables. It is often forgotten that millions of Russians and Poles also fell victim to the Nazi killing machine. I grieved them all. The events of the Holocaust may seem far away to many of you, separated as we are by decades of progress. But for those of us who lived through them, as I did as a boy in occupied Poland, they are all too real. By the age of 9, when the Nazi Germany invaded, I was overnight a refugee, out of school, out of childhood, and constantly in clear and present danger. What followed was the ghettos, work camps, and most of my family falling victim to the Holocaust. Even during those apocalyptic times, with so many Poles hostile and anti-Semitic, there were moments of light, with some Polish Catholics risking their lives to save Jews, some in my own family. In the dark sea of anti-Semitism and collaboration that swept occupied Europe, there were some islands of light. The saving of the entire Jewish population by the people of Denmark will remain forever as a rare epitome of true humanism. I find it striking that a country which was as anti-Semitic as Poland produced the highest number of righteous Gentiles, non-Jews who saved Jews, recognized as such by Yad Vashem in Israel. And yes, there are stories of bravery and righteousness, of individuals standing up to be counted when the time to do so has come. I think of a young German soldier who found my maternal grandparents in their hiding place and, risking his life, decided not to turn them in. They thus survived for a few more months until caught in the Nazi net. I think of the Polish Warsaw Catholic baker who sheltered a little girl for all these years, risking her life and that of her own daughter. I think of Aristides de Sousa Mendes, the Portuguese consul in Bordeaux, who in defiance of explicit orders saved thousands of Jews by giving them visas and was, as a result, destroyed by Salazar. Or the Pole Jan Karski, who infiltrated Warsaw Ghetto and concentration camp and then traveled to the West to report to the Allies on the unbelievable destruction that was being inflicted on the Jews. Alas, bombing rail lines to the death camps was not on the Allies' priority list. It is from acts of humanity that seeds of reconciliation and a shared sense of humanity emerge. Remembrance and acknowledgement of historic crimes, coming clean with the past, is essential to the process of reconciliation. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote in his Summa Theologica that sins that wrong our neighbors require not only repentance or penance, but also doing what is possible to repair the harm. Is this not what Adenauer's Germany tried to do in response to the Holocaust? I pay homage to President Chirac, who, breaking with a long taboo accepted the responsibility of France for Vichy's collaboration with the enforcement of the Holocaust, for committing, in the words of Chirac, the irreparable. When the war ended, I emerged with a hunger for school, for learning, for normality. That I, a child of the Holocaust, was given by fate the honor of presiding over UN war crimes tribunals and of judging the Jan Kerstich appeal, the first post-war genocide committed on European soil, the mass killings in Srebrenica, and doing it justly and fairly, is to me one of the wonders of my life. The shattering acts of Holocaust still defy logic and belief. Of course, mass atrocities, even genocides, have been committed throughout history. But the Holocaust was the first ever industrial genocide. That hatred, bigotry, antisemitism could lead to an amazingly efficient, technological, scientifically informed, bureaucratically run death machine, and to continent-wide losses, not only of individuals, families, and whole communities, but of basic humanity and shared human dignity as well, boggles the mind, even now. They were of a sort that the world has never seen. That people as cultured and educated as the Germans could accept to be ruled by monsters such as Hitler, a personification of absolute evil. That peoples of occupied Europe could largely collaborate with the enforcement of the Holocaust remains a mystery and a stain. And if it could happen in the country of Bach, Goethe, and Kant, could it not, given the right circumstances, happen in any country? And could not most of us become perpetrators of genocides? That is why we must remain vigilant and make sure that genocides are never, anywhere allowed to happen again. While celebrating the rebellions of the Warsaw Ghetto and of the inmates of Treblinka, which led to the destruction and the end of Treblinka, we still hear questions as to why Jews did not engage in more acts of resistance. What did they have left to lose? There were, of course, below the radar, lots of acts of individual resistance. My older brother reportedly died in the Treblinka rebellion. But is it really surprising that until it was too late, people refused to believe that the road from a ghetto or a labor camp was one way only, leading straight to the gas chamber, that it was the unthinkable that was true, and how to rebel in the face of hostile populations, often ready to denounce, even to fight Jewish resistance. The Holocaust did not happen out of the blue. It was not Deus ex machina. Consider the incredibly efficient anti-Semitic hate and annihilation campaign by Goebbels and his propaganda machine. Alas, that propaganda fell on fertile soil of anti-Semitism, not only in Germany. As Secretary General Guterres memorably said, the Holocaust was not simply the result of the insanity of the criminal Nazis. It was the culmination of centuries of hatred, scapegoating, and discrimination. Tragically, today, anti-Semitism is again rearing its ugly head. Could the Holocaust have happened without those who diverted their eyes, closed their hearts and doors, the bystanders, not to mention the collaborators, those that denounced, delivered, plundered. That is why words matter, why United Nations Human Rights Conventions criminalize egregious hate speech, and the Genocide Convention, inspired by the Holocaust, treats direct and public incitement to genocide as a distinct, separate act of genocide, as a crime in itself, an inchoate crime, punishable even when acts of genocide do not result from the incitement. I wish I could say that after the Holocaust, we would never again see more genocides, more ethnic or religious mass slaughters. I grieve at the knowledge that such appalling acts have been and are being repeated and have deeply wounded the communities concerned. I grieve for Srebrenica, for the Rwandan genocide, for Darfur, Syria, the Yazidis, Rohingya, and many others. Humanity's continued capacity for inhumanity knows no bounds. Today, when principles of international humanitarian law are under particular stress, our vigilance against atrocities must be greater than ever. But while it is vital that we remember what the Holocaust exposed about the worst in human nature, we should also acknowledge the efforts made by the United Nations and the global community to try to prevent acts of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes in the years that followed. It was after World War II that the international community came together to declare the value of individual human rights and dignity, to adopt the Geneva Convention's rules for the protection of civilians, and to outlaw acts of genocide by the Genocide Convention. We must remember that it was in response to the terrible atrocities of World War II that the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, imperfect as it may have been, set vital new precedents by holding individuals responsible for international crimes and by refusing to accept an accused official position as a defense to the charges against him. Nuremberg preceded, however, the recognition in international law of the crime of genocide. Atrocities against Jews were charged in Nuremberg as crimes against humanity. The United Nations War Crimes Tribunals embody the international community's continued commitment to ensuring individual criminal accountability for the worst crimes imaginable and to trials which are epitomized not by vengeance, but by fairness and due process. The Genocide Convention is the flagship of post-war international law aimed at preventing and punishing genocide, of which the Holocaust is, of course, a prime example. It also prohibits conspiracy to commit genocide. It outlaws certain acts committed with the intent to destroy a number of protected groups in whole or in part, not only by killing simpliciter, but also by causing serious bodily or mental harm, or deliberately imposing on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. The UN War Crimes Tribunals have fleshed out what such acts may entail. In the Yugoslavia Tribunal of General Tolimir, over which I presided, we held that threats of death and knowledge of impending death can amount to such serious mental harm for purposes of the crime of genocide as to constitute a separate act of genocide. Whether the persons concerned survived or were killed. For me, this resonates with the case of Jews crowded together in the most inhumane conditions in cattle cars on the way to extermination camps. Some rulings have broader implications as well, far beyond the realm of jurists and scholars. In the Jan Tolimir case, we recognized that the victims of the crime of genocide are not only those who were subjected to specific genocidal acts, rather all individuals belonging to the targeted part of a protected group are to be considered victims of genocide. While this is a legally meaningful holding, it is also of great significance for those who survived the terrible events at issue in that case, for it offers recognition of what the genocide means, not just for those who lost their lives, but for entire communities and peoples. It is perhaps a truism, but this kind of recognition and the ability to call a crime by its name, genocide, do matter. They matter a great deal. In a radio address in August 1941, just 2 months after Germany's surprise attack on Russia, Winston Churchill described the atrocities committed by the advancing German troops as the crime without a name. Just a few years later, Raphael Lemkin would give a name to crimes such as these, genocide. He played also a unique role in persuading governments to ratify the Genocide Convention. The Kirsty judgment, following upon the jurisprudence of our sister tribunal for Rwanda, marked the first time when the appeals chamber of the tribunal for the former Yugoslavia recognized the crime committed in Srebrenica for what it was, a genocide. My court ended its judgment by saying that those responsible will bear this stigma of genocide, which will also serve as a warning to those who may in the future contemplate the commission of such heinous acts. Today, we remember those whom we have lost so many years ago, but we also, through this event, honor those who took invaluable steps to prevent even greater losses. Today, in this General Assembly Hall, we honor those who were saved and those who took courageous action to save their neighbors from certain death. That we pause to reflect upon the Holocaust and remember those lost is vitally important. That we learn from all that has taken place is imperative, and it is all the more vital that we take every opportunity, as we are doing now, to learn from the generation that survived, from those who lived through the chaos and calamities of those years. They, and perhaps I should say we, lost too many, and soon we too will be gone, leaving those of you gathered here to carry our stories forward in the future, as well as that most essential lesson, never again. So let us pray. Pray not only that neither we nor our children will be victims, or even worse, perpetrators of genocides, but to paraphrase Sir Michael Howard's Holocaust speech in the Oxford Chabad Society, that we will not be those, and I quote, who simply let this happen, thinking the kind of things, tolerating the kind of behavior that ultimately makes genocides possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Moran, for your remarks and especially for your incredible lifelong contribution that you have brought to building global justice. Ladies and gentlemen, as we draw to the close of today's ceremony, I would like to call Cantor Shulam Lema to recite formal prayers. In keeping with the solemnity of the prayers, I would like to ask you kindly not to applaud.
Rachamim Shochev Nebameromim Hamitzei Menuchonechoeno Alekanefev Yashechino B'malois kedoishim utehoerim kezo yararukia mazirim lenishemos sheishes milyone haYehudim chalelei haShoah beEuropa uyacheinu v'yachyiseinu Anoshim, noshim, votav. Shehu mesu, u'vishenerigu, u'visheni Vishenidbiu Vishenechriku Vishenisrifu Chayim HaKidush Hashem Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor, Vishar Machanoi Samoves, Machanoi Saikutz Ghettos beEuropa. Al yedei Atzorim Anatsim Yozrehem, Yemach Shemam v'Zichram. שכל העם היהודי ואומו ישראל מתפללים לעילוי נשמותיהם מגני Astirem vi sei serken ofov leo elamim Vitzroid achayim es nishmo esevem Adonai unachalosom veyonuchu v'shalom al mishkivo esem v'noemar Amen. We will now sing a song that is synonymous to the Holocaust, which is known to be sung on the trains and composed on the trains to the death camps. And if you know the song, feel free to sing along with me. Ani mamin, ani mamin, ani mamin. Be'emuno shelemo, bevias HaMoshiach, bevias HaMoshiach, ani mamin. Bevias HaMoshiach, bevias HaMoshiach, ani mamin. Ani mamin, ani mamin, ani mamin. Be'emuno sheleimo, bevias HaMoshiach, bevias HaMoshiach, ani mamin. Ani mamin, ani mamin, ani mamin. Be'emuno sheleimo, bevias HaMoshiach, bevias HaMoshiach, ani mamin. V'afal pi sheismamea, im kol ze ani mamin. Im kol ze achak Eloi bechol yom sheyovoi.
Thank you, Cantor Lema. Friends, 15 years ago, the United Nations General Assembly mandated a program of outreach about the Holocaust. Today's ceremony is part of this program. Across the world today, in UN offices all over the world, similar remembrance ceremonies are being organized. And throughout the year, This program continues its outreach and mobilizes civil society against anti-Semitism, against hate, urging the world to remember through Holocaust education and remembrance. We encourage you, as part of this, to join us immediately after this morning's ceremony in the visitors' lobby at the opening of the stirring exhibition called Seeing Auschwitz. Dear guests, today is a time for reflection and remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust. 2020 is an auspicious year, 75 years after Auschwitz, 75 years after the Holocaust, and 75 years of the United Nations. We look back so we can consider best what to do to build a world in which we can all thrive, in which justice for all prevails, and the right to live with dignity and in peace in a healthy world is ensured. It's through our collective action to build together such a world that we show our respect for and pay tribute to the victims of the Holocaust and all those who survived. Thank you, all of you, for being with us here today, and we wish you well. Thank you.